Hello and welcome back to the GI podcast. I am your host, Sid Heeg.
And I'm Toben Racicot.
And today we are joined by Dr. Gerald Voorhees, who is an associate professor in communication arts at Waterloo and a longstanding faculty member here at the GI. So thank you so much for joining us today. We are so thankful to have you here.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So we like to start off with all our guests asking, what is your earliest memory of games?
Okay, that's a great question, and I promise I'm not copying from any previous GI podcasts that I've heard before, but my earliest memory with games was, this must have been 1986, 1987. I was living in South Korea. My dad was Air Force stationed there. My mom brought home... my parents brought home a Commodore 64, and you know, for the longest time they just about 4 to 6 months they just used it to balance their checkbook, do their taxes, etc.
Right.
And then one day my mom came home with a stack of floppy disks, and she said, this person at my work just gave me like a bunch of video games.
Oh, wow.
And so Lunar Lander is the one that stands out because I could never successfully land the Lunar Lander. But you know, Pitfall, Pac-Man clones, Asteroid clones, on that Commodore 64 in the downstairs hallway, my brother and I taking turns, my parents occasionally taking a spot at taking a go at it, but yeah.
Were video games like a foreign concept for them, or were they familiar with like arcades, or right? Because I'm always curious when parents introduce the games, that's always really interesting to me because that's not what happened in my house. It was always my siblings being like, look, here's Tetris, here's Pokemon and stuff. So did they bring this home thinking like, this is like a book but interactive, or were they hesitant about it?
I don't think that they really had a strong sense of what they were. You know, I think that my parents had seen video games before, you know, had seen them in arcades, but it wasn't really a part of their everyday lives, and it wasn't a part of the culture that they associated themselves with. You know, my dad was military, and like it was cigar and billiards, and you know, my mom was working her way through university like part time, you know, as a sort of a transplant as an immigrant from Taiwan, and you know, it was just this thing that they brought home. And in fact, like a couple of weeks prior, my mom had brought home like a stack of VHS tapes that like, hey, my colleague at work, you know, copied a bunch of movies for us, and like 20 tapes. So like 60 movies or something. Right. You know, I think it's just something that they thought that we'd be interested in. You know, they sort of recognized that we were in a place across the world feeling a little bit alone and isolated, and as brothers will do, not necessarily playing nice with each other all the time, right? I mean, there's a limit to how much you can play nice with your brother or your sibling, and so it was, you know, here's another thing, here's a distraction. You know, my colleague says they're fun. I kind of trust them not to give you smuts or, violence and gore. So here you go. Yeah.
Very good. And remind me, were you the older brother or were you the younger brother?
The younger by 2 years.
Okay. Very good. Very good.
No, it's kind of like super interesting in terms of like how we talk about how we're kind of like naturalized into games, or how we're kind of like shown into games, of either it's like from the parent perspective, or it's from, you're hearing it from school, and then you're like going to your parent and you're like, can we please get this or invest in it, because it just sounds very interesting. So it's kind of like interesting to see when that started happening.
Yeah. And a total stranger brought a total stranger to me, and a work acquaintance, of my parents, and they trusted them enough to bring this new thing into the home.
So now I'm going to pivot a little bit into more of just your expertise and the things that you have explored a bit into your research. And you've written quite a bit about masculinity and fatherhood, particularly within games, and especially during the quote unquote like dadification of games. And that happened about a decade ago. So how do you think this trend has sort of like continued, or has it been challenged or changed at all? Like, what do you see is kind of like happening there in games?
Yeah. That's thanks for giving me the opportunity to reflect on that. Like um, my work has sort of bounced between race and culture and whiteness and gender and masculinity, and feminist criticism and and through genre and eSports and through various sorts of questions. And I really do cherish the work on masculinity, and particularly the stuff on Dadification, which came out of a really interesting time for me because my daughter was born in January of 2012, and I recall playing The Last of Us, like during her nap times, right? During the day, and sometimes that would line up with my free time in the evening. So my initial paper on Dadification, on masculinities and fatherhoods in The Last of Us and in BioShock 2, on BioShock Infinite, was, very much inspired by my lived experience in relation to the game. And my follow-up work on and other subsequent work and prior work actually on eSports was really primarily motivated by my own sort of sense of self-identity as a white presenting person with Asian heritage, thinking about the sorts of masculinities that are involved in eSports. My original paper on the rationalization of eSports was originally conceived of as a paper about Asian masculinities in eSports. But sorry, I digress. Back to Dadification, right? Like it's sort of become like not worth talking about as a phenomena because it's become so widespread, right? I wrote a paper for Canadian Game Studies Association a couple of years after the publication of the Ada piece on Last of Us and BioShock Infinite, where I talked about like dadification. Is it a phenomena or a trope or something else? And I think that like it was for a while a distinct trope, right, where you saw certain characteristics of fatherhood, certain sorts of situations and troubles, right, problems around fatherhood that were taken up in these games, and then we just started to see those get diffused broadly across games, right? And sometimes, sometimes they stuck with fathers and they stuck with male father figures, right? Sort of deconstructing the father and thinking more around father figures. But sometimes, like, right, they began to be diffused around, and I'm thinking about Sarah Stang's work around like mothers, right? And other sorts of figures in games. And, so I think that to a certain extent, there was a moment where it was distinctly about masculinity and fatherhood, and we still see resurgences of that moment, like Dad of War 2, right, came out just 3 or 4 years ago, but also we see a broad diffusion of those sorts of questions and issues of responsibility and nurturing and protecting, right? Not just destroying something, but protecting someone, more diffuse through games generally.
It's very interesting because when I'm thinking of like the examples that you brought up, so like Last of Us, BioShock, especially Infinite from what I'm remembering, because that's the one I can remember the most clearly. And then also like the God of War series, it's the reluctant male protagonist becoming kind of like a father figure in that regard. And I think it kind of speaks to wanting to, like, there is this, especially within even broader forms of media, like I'm thinking of, like, say, like The Mandalorian or something, seeing this gruff figure who doesn't really connect to people suddenly open up his heart or his feelings to someone who is very incredibly vulnerable. I think there is something that we really appeal to that, or we really kind of like want that kind of content.
Yeah, and I'm not, and I definitely wouldn't suggest that you know, fatherhood and questions around masculinity aren't still like central forces animating, right, this cultural phenomena. And in fact, right, you really do see the trope and the sorts of questions and situations that these games and these other media forms tend to explore, like really crystallizing around that. I think that is the core set of texts, or you know, around which Dadification can be described. God of War, Last of Us, and Bioshock, in the Bioshock series, I'm kind of sort of losing my train of thought here, but I do think that, you know, it's important to think about how you know, they really do speak to an ongoing crisis in masculinity, right? And so no matter how diffuse those elements may get in games and other media, there's still, right, that starting point and that context that starting point points us to, which is the fact that whether you choose to call it a crisis of masculinity or just changing dynamics of masculinity, or however you want to frame it, right, there are serious issues with masculinity in contemporary culture that those sorts of games speak a lot more, and those direct representations speak a lot more directly to. That, you know, maybe it's not gotten quite as popular to speak directly to them. Maybe, you know, it's become more economical and more cost effective in terms of reaching various audiences to generalize some of those issues and some of those problems, you know, to other sorts of figures, familial and otherwise. But there's something certainly at the heart of those figures and those tropes that really speaks to that important and ongoing issue around masculinity. Yeah.
So those are mostly single player games, right? They are single player games. But I want to come back to this thread that you brought up about eSports. Esports fascinates me because I know hardly anything about it, except for the games they play are pretty toxic for the most part, from what I understand, right? The MOBAs, the fighting game scene can be kind of weird. So I guess, where did your interest in that scene start, and kind of what were the aspects of it, if it's only masculinity, that's fine, but that you were examining, and what were the conclusions you were finding?
Yeah. Thanks. That's really interesting to think about the two things in relationship to another, and sort of what goes outside of that, right? The esports masculinity, you know, the direct orbit of those two things. And I think that, well, I can start by sort of backing up and saying that what initially drew me to the question, you know, as I mentioned earlier, was I was thinking about Asian masculinity. So I was thinking about race, right, in these forums, and I was really inspired by Todd Harper's monograph. I'm forgetting the name right now, but he examines fighting game cultures, and he's primarily looking at the performance of gender and masculinity, but he also does spend some time talking about the whiteness, right, of those fighting game cultures, which is very interesting because fighting game communities are actually much more diversely racialized, and blackness has a stronger presence in the fighting game community than in most other esports.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the core, right, cultural value and norms of whiteness, right, within that community, and so I was really inspired by that question about race, masculinity, and whiteness, right, in the fighting games community, to think about that in terms of games like StarCraft, right, where you know, there's been this really strong uptake, and in fact the esport around StarCraft, right, really was born out of the South Korean gaming scene, and so thinking about those questions of race, but I had a very difficult time articulating it well ultimately to race. I think because at that time most of my scholarship had been around whiteness and around questions about how societies deal with multiculturalism, so I wasn't quite equipped to talk about Asianness quite yet. And so what I ended up talking about it in terms of was about neoliberalism and the ways that eSports tends to rationalize and make most efficient modes of play that in other contexts are thought of as creative, exploratory modes of discovery, right? But here in this context being rationalized, a lot of kind of sort of in the same vein that Chris Patterson in Open World Empires talks about different modes of play as racializations, right? And I think that if I could go back to it, I might just say, look at Chris Patterson, right? Because like what I'm trying to say about Asian masculinities in esports, I think he really captures well when he talks about different styles of play, different play styles, and different norms of employing certain techniques are racialized in and of themselves. And I think that does what I was trying to do 10 years ago, but he does it incredibly well and using, right, the theory and the language that is required to actually help people understand that, right? So it was ultimately those questions around race that I was hoping to explore, and that I eventually did come back, actually in a chapter in Chris Patterson and Tara Fickle's forthcoming book on Made in Asian America, how games it's something to the effect of how games never really were for us, for Asian players, right? So an anthology of Asian American game studies, essentially. So I eventually did come back to this in a co-authored piece with Matt Howard, who's an assistant professor at I'm forgetting exactly where, and he's not going to be happy about that, but Loyola University Chicago. We co-authored a piece on Asian masculinities originally, but his work in Korean diasporic culture ultimately led to us focusing that on Korean masculinities in esports. And so I eventually did to sort of connect the circle and come back to those original questions. But the detour was through masculinities, which I explored, neoliberalism as neoliberalism inflected masculinities, which I explored through a chapter in a University of Illinois collection on sports and games, and then through another chapter in Masculinities in Play, which I edited with Nick Taylor on sort of the boy bandization of masculinity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's kind of like super interesting, especially since like from like a content consumption part of it, there has been like obviously a huge uptick with how, especially say in music, where K-pop has really come in, but also how a lot of Western fans view the men who are coming from K-pop and the constant kind of like feminization that kind of goes over there because they've got different beauty standards than we do over here. So it's kind of like interesting to see all how that kind of comes together and what that may do for men from those communities and how that kind of impacts their own sense of masculinity. Absolutely. And I will say that like I wasn't ready to explore that yet. So the essay about the boy bandization of masculinities in Masculinities in Play was something that I co-authored with Alex Orlando, who is at that time a graduate student here at the GI English department in the GI. And this was really her framework. Like I don't remember the exact conversation, but it was essentially something like, have you ever noticed how there are different tropes or different figures of masculinity in gaming culture, much like, the sorts of different
person types within a boy band, right?
I love that. That's so
which are
awesome.
intentionally and deliberately constructed,
Right,
right?
yeah.
You know, they are put together by music industry figures in order to say, here's a kind of soft masculinity that's going to be very safe and comfortable. Here's a kind of hard, like rough masculinity that people are just going to find like, you know, so traditional and, you know, heteronormative canon, right? That's like the notion of masculinity you think of. And then, you know, here's some slight variations on those masculinities, and look how they all work together in this harmonious boy band. And it was such a great observation, and sort of working through that observation and my my analytics of neoliberalism, we managed to talk about, right, how these different representations of these different figures of masculinity sort of came together to make a composite picture that was very much appealing to the neoliberal economic logics of esports teams as they were marketing themselves to audiences. Yeah.
So do you participate? Like, do you watch esports other than for research, or
Not anymore.
not anymore? You know, you've had your fill of it.
Yeah, but for certainly for a while I was following StarCraft 2, and I followed that for about 5 years, and then when that sort of lost its luster and people started, you know, tuning into League of Legends and etc., I sort of, you know, slowly backed away from the scene, and which is why it was really great that Matt Howard, you know, worked with me on that last paper, and he's done a lot of work and invested a lot of time in studying League of Legends scene, and that really made that paper what it was.
So a lot of the issues that we've been touching on, especially with what you've been working in, especially around Asian identity in gaming and also masculinity in gaming, this kind of like brings up what you've done recently within the recently wrapped ADE for Games Communities Workshop and Speaker Series, which you were the co-PI with Dr. Daniel Harley on, which sort of brings together a large variety of speakers from different academic institutions, game studios, and other walks of life where games are a part of what they do. So when you were working on that series, what were you hoping to emphasize with the wide diversity of people that you involved in it?
Yeah, that is a really great question, and a very hard question because it forces me to reflect on this in a in a way that, like, I'm really hoping to just put it in the rearview mirror. Not that it wasn't great work, but that it was incredibly time consuming. But even as I say that, we're actually still working on it. We're working with an amazing undergraduate research assistant, Astra Pinney, this term to help publish a book with ETC Press that sort of organizes a lot of the arguments and the ideas in there. And you know, when I talk about it in that context, it does help me to sort of come to a crystallization. The series was really imagined as a way of bringing together not necessarily the bleeding edge, but some really innovative and newer ways of thinking about things, newer questions that are being asked, and often that are being asked because the people that are asking them are coming from perspectives and experiences and even ways of knowing that are not traditionally represented in academe, right, as a Western colonial institution. And so, you know, Black and Indigenous scholars and other racialized scholars that are looking at games, you know, in turn and challenging the sorts of representations in them, and looking at, right, how conventional representations like reinforce whiteness and coloniality, and looking at the spaces of possibility for Indigenous and Black creators, right, to offer alternate modes of thinking that emerge from different styles of representation in relation to the ways that the gameplay, right, the ways that people actually engage those games. And so bringing Andre Brock and Ashley Bird and Tara Fickle and Elaine Gomez, right, was really an amazing opportunity, not just to give some stellar voices, an additional platform, but also to help people who do games research from more conventional directions, right, with more conventional sorts of theories and assumptions, asking, the sorts of questions that are derived from those perspectives, right, to show them what other kinds of questions we could ask, right, and what other theories and modes of analysis we could apply to games and to gaming communities in order to really get to the answers to those questions. And then the workshops and the panels that accompanied those, marquee speakers, were really oriented towards getting granular, right? And so, you've heard the tools, that you've heard the concepts and the theories, and you've got an idea of the tools. Like, now let's get into the reads, right, and start actually thinking through them with those workshops and those panels. So yeah.
Were there any moments during any of those that made you sit back and go, "Whoa, this is really cool"?
Tara Fickle's work will do that for me all the time. And I think that, like, her talk absolutely, gave me that sort of moment when she was really working through the relationship between representations and performances and enactments of whiteness, Asianness, and blackness in eSports, and particularly in marketing around eSports. And I think that, I mentioned this briefly in the follow-up to the panel. We ran out of time because it was the only panel where we experienced technical difficulties. Despite the amazing work of the GI staff to set everything up, like, there was a university-wide wireless outage, I think, right?
Yeah, like the whole power of the building was shut down. So
it's a power outage, yeah, not just a wireless outage, power outage, right? But I briefly, like, at the end of it, I briefly commented that, like, her talk just poked at so many lingering questions and tensions in the field of American studies and in Asian American studies as well, around the relationships between Asianness, whiteness, and blackness or Afrocentricity in American culture, and right in the theorizing and thinking of those fields. I think that Kata Spiel's talk also really did an amazing job, and maybe that's because Kata Spiel was talking primarily about accessibility and studying disability in games, and that is maybe the furthest thing from my own work. So maybe it was a bit of this is not quite my area, and so learning about this is very eye-opening. But also, like, just Kata's ability to explain with such precision and such eloquence and flourish, like, the distinction between accessibility and inaccessibility, and the different models of thinking about disability and how they structure and guide the sorts of research and practice that people do. That was pretty stellar as well.
Was that a focus on, like, mechanics, accessible mechanics, or was it the physicality of, like, controllers? Or do you recall the specifics of what accessible? It
was fairly broad. Yeah, it was covering both of those things and other things as well. I think the thing that really struck me, is sort of between those two ideas, which is that a lot of the ways that games are designed to be accessible is motivated by the thinking that making this game accessible is a way of nerfing it, right? Making this game accessible is a way of ruining or dumbing down, right, the experience of it, and just showing how that sort of thinking around accessibility and disability pervades so much of game making, even the game making that is aimed towards, communities of players with accessibility needs, right? There's this underlying bias that sort of, reflects poorly on the maker's view of their audience, despite their intentions otherwise to make something for that audience.
Because I've been thinking about that again with the Elden Ring DLC announced, because that was a big discourse when Elden Ring was coming out of like, it's way more, people are much more interested in it than the previous entries that FromSoft has made. But there was a big discussion about like, can we just get an easy mode? Because so many people wanted to play it. So you have the hardcore people that have been playing FromSoft games from the beginning saying, no, this is the game. And then everybody else saying, well, I just don't want to die all the time because I want to experience the game. And so there's an interesting back and forth of like, this is what the artist intended. But then the community saying, that's great, but we want to be able to take in what the artist has offered us, right? So
yeah, for sure. And I think that definitely is an example, right, of how that kind of tension in the thinking, right, can show up. When members of the community, right, will engage in that sort of discourse, right? And what was really powerful about Kata's talk was their capacity to show how that showed up even when the discourse, right, wasn't front and center from the community or from the developers. But that is absolutely a really great example of that, right? And I mean, beyond questions of accessibility, there's also questions of like play style. And it's here I go back and evoke Chris Patterson once again, right? Different play styles speak to different, if not racializations, then different sorts of experiences and identities, right? And communities of players that organize themselves around a type of experience, right? And a type of knowledge or meaning generated from that experience. And so like, yeah, beyond accessibility, if some people want to play for story, that's a kind of experience and a kind of meaning that we take away from our play, that is distinct in so many ways from like the hardcore die every 2 minutes, right? sort of play style, right? Mode of engagement.
Yeah. That was like something that I know came up when the Death Stranding first came out, because they made a specific just cinematic mode for the people who don't play games, because they just wanted to experience this new big hyped up Hideo Kojima game and they just wanted to experience it. So they made a specific story mode for those players.
That's fascinating. I almost wonder if he was like, no, just like let them watch it.
Let them watch it. It's a movie. It's a cinematic experience, but through a video game.
That would work really well for him, I feel like.
I think there's also something very interesting that this series kind of highlighted, which I think is extremely topical right now, especially when you had members of Soft Chaos, the Montreal-based cooperative game studio, Squinky and Dr. Jess Rowan Marcotte, but also the researchers within the First 3 Year project, especially, which is so relevant with all of these recent video game layoffs, about how do we apply a lot of the things that we're talking about within research and academic circles about not only making like sustainable games for community players to engage with, but also the developers themselves, which I just think right now is completely eroding because so many jobs have been lost in the last like 2 months alone. So is there anything else that you could potentially see about that?
I mean, to be honest, not on face. Like I think that, beyond the core and I think essential idea that workers need to unionize, I don't know if I have much to add to that. I think that, in fact, I would say that one area where the speaker series was not at its strongest, because we chose to focus on race primarily and on gender and sexuality secondarily, was we didn't leave a lot of space for thinking about capitalism and class, right? In the way that gaming is not just a community and a culture, but it is also an industry, right? It is an incredibly exploitative industry that relies upon the rhetoric of play and playfulness to put up this veneer of, it's work, but it's also fun. And, you only get so much time on the playing fields, your time happens to be up, move along and we'll bring in somebody younger who'll do it for, less money. Right. Unfortunately my own thinking, is not quite as developed in that area as well. beyond, right, that there's a need to unionize, and to do so broadly, and internationally, to link up these collective efforts, because outsourcing and offshoring is a real thing, in the games industry and elsewhere, but in the games industry too.
So let's talk about the GI.
Okay.
When did you link up with the GI?
I linked up with the GI in 2013, in fall of 2013, very shortly after I came to Waterloo. Funny story, Neil actually wrote a chapter that was in a book that I co-edited on role-playing games, Dungeons, Dragons, and Digital Denizens, the digital role-playing game, which we published with Bloomsbury, but at that time they were Continuum in 2012. And so I kind of sort of knew Neil before I even came to Waterloo. Once I got here, he reached out, it's like, hey, we've got this thing going on. Love to see you get involved. My first few efforts to get involved were not super successful. Like I was on some planning and some strategy committees that were mostly dominated by students, and by hard science, computer science students, in fact. And of course, English students were part of those conversations too, but the really loud and outspoken voices were not English students at the time. I was like, hey, I'm willing to keep showing up to these meetings, but I'm not really getting anything out of it. And frankly, I don't think these folks are listening to me, and I don't think they're getting anything out of it either. So, maybe I just, walk away for a bit. And he was like, well, we've got this other thing going on. It's called First Person Scholar. You've edited some books. Like maybe you can, bring some of that editing, insight and experience to this. And so I met with Steve Wilcox, Mike Hancock, Kent Arts, and Jason Haverlack, and we talked about FPS and about their vision for it. And at the time, they were writing like 2/3 to 3/4 of the articles in FPS. Wow. It was really an act. It was a passion project. It was an act of love and a labor of love, of course, for them. So I worked with them to, encourage them to publicize, do more publicizing and soliciting of papers, right, and submissions. I work with them to establish a advisory board, which was very short-lived, but included some notable names, right, in the game studies community. For a little while, we actually did this thing where they would respond to the articles, and then the article writers, right, would respond back, and some, the idea was that, hey, maybe a dialogue emerges out of this, who knows? But either way, that this person in the field who's done cool work before is reading your work and is responding to it, right? And that was incredibly hard to maintain that workflow, right, of not only receiving submissions, editing them in tandem, right, with the authors, but then bringing in this person from the advisory board to also make some comments, and then, right, circling back to the author to provide additional work. So that didn't do a lot, or that didn't last very long. But I'd like to think that, I don't think that my efforts, that's what made FPS, but I'd like to think that I played a role in helping them get out of the mode in which they produced 60% of the content, right? Mm-hmm. And so they had and I'll also say that Rob Parker, who did their social media, during that time, and actually like for another 10 years. I think he only stopped doing their social media like 5 years ago, 3 to 5 years ago or something like that, was also amazing. But yeah, so that was my introduction to the Games Institute, and it was really great working with those folks. And I was really stoked when the next year they brought in Emma and Elise, Emma Vosen and Elise Vist, and because it was very much like a boys club, like not intentionally, like I think these folks had the best of intentions. I hope I had the best of intentions, but these were the people who volunteered and showed interest in this project from the get-go. And I was incredibly happy to see them sort of broaden their staff. And Emma and Elise didn't immediately join. In fact, I don't think Elise ever did officially join, although perhaps they did. Yeah, and First Person Scholars history is one of expanding their authorship pool in the same way that we often talk about game culture needing to expand its understandings of who is included. Going from that group of cis white guys, that started the publication writing 60% of the articles to bringing in more gender diversity when Emma and Elise started with the publication, not simply writing but also helping to solicit additional voices, and then culminating in Emma Vosen's editor-in-chiefship, and then after that Betsy Bray's, with a lot of work, successful, I think, in ensuring racial and ethnic and diversity of other identities, contributing to the enterprise at that point as well. And most of that was not me at all, but I was so happy to play a part in those early days, and I think my contributions catalyzed some changes, but of course the students running the show, all credit to them, they did the work that made it really successful.
And I think it's something that we kind of sometimes overlook within the conversations we're having here, just within this podcast, is that we've talked to a lot of that kind of first generation of these emerging game scholars, especially during that time, which is early 2010s. Gamergate was coming out. So for you as, say, the supervisor, especially since you were either mentoring these students or straight out supervising them like you were with Betsy Bray, do you have any comments or feedback for other supervisors who may be finding themselves in these positions of trying to help these students who are working in sometimes very toxic communities?
What a challenging question. Thank you, Sid. I'm not sure. Let me talk through some thoughts here.
Sure.
So, I think that I think that my advice would be very similar to the advice that I give to junior faculty now that I find myself a department chair, which is do the work that you are passionate about, but protect yourself. Mm-hmm. Make sure that you're doing what you need to do to protect yourself. And so, Betsy's thesis explored some really difficult things, like how white supremacist communities, utilize mainstream gaming and fantasized and reimagined mainstream gaming as fantasies of white supremacy. And, it was really important for them. I will say that I didn't have to do a lot of intervention here, cause Betsy is incredibly on top of things. But it was really important, for Betsy to keep, that critical distance and to recognize how far do I need to dip my toes into these cesspools in order to get the data and the information that I need? Thankfully it was just a tiny bit, right?
Yeah.
But for other folks like Emma's work, her thesis work and her work prior to that, right, that got her at the center of some Gamergate shitstorms, like, I obviously I was not her advisor. We did have some conversations about these kinds of things, but I really admire her capacity to wade into some of these and to weather those shitstorms. But I do advise students and my colleagues now to make sure that you know what you're getting into, right? And to not go beyond your capacity, because ultimately what you're doing, there's some social impact to that, right? There's social impact to the scholarship that we do. It shows up in our teaching, it shows up in non-governmental organizations that take our scholarship and 1 or 2 degrees removed, apply that thinking to the work that they're doing. Our scholarship is impactful, although not often in the ways that we may have imagined when we first got into this work. But ultimately it's work, right? And you never want to put yourself, online for your work, because, institutions, professions don't love you the way that you love your work, and the way that hopefully people love themselves.
That's great advice. I actually just saw a post with this recent Sony layoff, where there's the thing going around on Reddit where the president of European Sony, he was in like Dublin or something, and he took a picture, and everybody's all bright and cheerful, right? And then like 2 days later, that whole studio was shut down. They're like, don't be beholden to these companies. Like, you have to look out for yourself and stuff.
Absolutely,
very timely with what's going on in the industry.
Yeah, and don't be beholden to that paper or that project, right? If you need to cut and run. And yeah, only dip your toes into that cesspool. You do not want to submerge yourself.
Okay, so you've worked in both American and Canadian academic game circles extensively. Then that kind of includes the conferences like CGSA, PCA Games. And how different do you think the Canadian and U.S. academic game spaces are, especially since you've had such a wide range of experiences?
That is a really interesting question because of the distinction between the specifics and the generalities there. So, I think that Canadian Game Studies Association and Popular Culture Association Game Studies areas actually have a lot in common. They are both really welcoming spaces for all kinds of scholars, and especially junior scholars, to start to take up questions, that they are maybe not familiar to them, that maybe they're not deeply versed in the literature on, and they're able to take up these questions and receive discussion and feedback and conversation that's not challenging or critical in the negative sense, right? And so I think that like both of those spaces are really similar in that regard, for different reasons. Like Pop Culture Association, there is no disciplinary home. People come from English, media, communication, religious studies, history, American studies, right? Various, linguistics, etc., various different disciplines. And so they often come to games as an object of criticism or object of study without the disciplinary background. Whereas Canadian game studies, right? It's a young, quote unquote, young field in general. But particularly in Canada, there aren't a huge number of established scholars, and especially 5 years ago, especially 10 years ago when I first arrived here, there weren't a huge number of established scholars. And so you just by dint of nature and numbers, you had so many more junior scholars coming into the spaces, and they were very interested in games, but there weren't games programs, so they were still coming at this from all these different angles, and yeah, so those spaces had to be welcoming, inclusive, and collaborative in that sense. That said, I've had some experience with games at NCA, National Communication Association, ICA, International Communication Association, that I found, quite challenging, not, and not pleasant, right? Which is not a reflection on the individual people leading those areas, right, and organizing those events, but rather just I think to some degree, it's a little bit about the confrontational and ways of challenging people's ideas that are more normalized in the American academic context, that aren't super pleasant, and so yeah, I do think that there are some important differences in terms of the way that ideas are received and criticism and discussion is carried on, but not necessarily between PCA and CGSA. I think there's a lot of similarity actually between those two organizations. Yeah.
So as we come to the conclusion, we've talked a lot about your work and your research interests and things like that, but what about your just kind of day-to-day gaming interests? What things are you playing? What things are you looking forward to? What takes up your time when the family's in bed and you get to have a half hour, an hour to yourself?
Great question. So I'm usually 6 months to 2 years behind.
Perfect. That's when you get the best deals.
No, absolutely. I am a firm believer in at least wait for the first price drop. Usually try to wait for the second price drop. And so I'm currently playing Stray, and enjoying it. It's great to be a cat. It's great to just meow, and just to lay down on my side or scratch at a carpet once in a while, and of course do movement puzzles and all that other stuff. And before that, I was playing Far Cry 6, and before that, I'm forgetting the name, the Minecraft, MOBA style Minecraft, where, was it Minecraft Legends? Yeah. I still have a soft spot for first person shooters. The politics are so bad. Not we could probably do a whole hour long discussion about the politics of first person shooters. It's not just the representation; it's the repetitive action, the core mechanic, right? But I still have a soft spot. It's something that I find myself coming back to as a way to just unplug and sort of just zone into this one particular thing, and consequences be damned, and the symbolic and communicative work that it does on me, I want to bracket that and just have this relatively thoughtless experience, and yeah, I know, I recognize that can be problematic as well. What is it that most people believe in media effects to some extent or another, but most people also think they're immune to them, but yeah, it's a comfort food for me, which unfortunately I no longer say about role-playing games. Those were my two go-to genres 15 years ago, hence my first two edited books being about role-playing games and first-person shooter games. But I'm just increasingly finding that my attention span and the evolution of role-playing game mechanics have just sort of, we've grown distant.
Yeah.
We've grown distant.
Do you have a favorite first-person shooter that you go back to? Or are you keeping your thumb on the current trends? Do you boot up the GameCube to do something weird every once in a while? Or are you just no, this is the
I don't want to open a can of worms,
Okay.
but I was never a Nintendo guy.
That's fine. I don't know.
But also, yeah. Well, I mean, 007, right, and Perfect Dark, right? But otherwise, yeah, that's right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like, I don't go back to the, like, I think if there's anything that I find myself playing the various Far Cry iterations as they come out. The mechanics are like, I'm familiar with them, right? And it's part of just sliding into that like easy, like, I'm just gonna do this for a bit, right?
There's not a learning curve, and you just jump right in.
Right, for sure. I haven't played it in quite a while, but I would say that like the first 3 games in the Halo series, the trilogy, like
that's
that
bread and
is
butter.
So much.
That is like my nostalgia point,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
For
Oh, yeah.
first person shooters. And like I tried to play Destiny. I did play Destiny for a while, and I tried to play Destiny 2. I hate the purchase.
Most people
the
try
DLC.
to play Destiny 2, I feel.
Yeah, and then they get alienated by the
game
purchasing
itself,
model.
yeah.
Well, the purchasing model for me, but there is this one level that I played where, I didn't buy any of the DLCs, so I just played like the 10 core missions. Like they're the first 2 missions of each campaign, and then you have to buy the last 5 missions of every campaign, and I refuse to do that. But there's this one like where they're constantly drop ships with like alien mobs coming out, and I texted a friend like, this just hits the sweet spot. This reminds me of the best parts of Halo 2 and Halo 3, and like the flow and the rhythm of it, and just chef's kiss, right? Amazing.
When Destiny works, it works.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so much that you have to wade through to find those sweet
For
spots.
sure.
I'm sure that wasn't even like more than 15 minutes, right? You had this probably
15-20 minutes.
Yeah. So this Netflix episode's worth of really good stuff in
A
the kind of
Netflix episode's
collective
worth of-
Absolutely.
20
Yeah.
hours of sifting through all that garbage.
For sure.
Well, we definitely could do another hour just about Halo if you wanted to come back and do the first-person
Please.
shooter version of this episode. But we appreciate your time. As we depart, is there anything that you'd like to plug, or where could people find you online to continue the conversation if they're interested?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can find me online. I'm on Twitter, refuse to call it X, at Gerald Voorhees. So pretty simple there. I'm not on as frequently as I was before, but I refuse to give up my presence there. Refuse to concede that space. But yeah, otherwise I'm not super online. Regarding like projects to shout out, I think I already mentioned that Daniel Harley and I are working with Astor Penny to put together a handbook essentially for researchers and teachers of collecting the various lessons from the ADE speaker series. The keynote lectures will be the core chapters of those, and then the workshops and various panels will be call outs, highlights, summarized, and interspersed through and across the various chapters, and it'll be supplemented with reading questions, just suggestions for further reading, and summaries with application ideas for application as well. And then we'll also I have in the works with my longtime editing partner Josh Call, as well as Betsy Bray and Matthew Wysocki, who edited the Rated and for Mature Sex and Video Games book, as well as a couple of other works. Edited the Alt Control Playbook as well. So the 4 of us are also editing 2-volume companion set of new formations in game genres, and I think Sid has a paper in one of these.
Yes, I know. That's a horror paper. I know.
Yeah, so new formations in game genres, And one of them is on emerging genres, which is focusing on changing mechanics and aesthetics in games, and micro genres and new genres that are emerging out of those. And the other is focusing on epistemic genres, which are sorts of genres that we conceive of as ways of engaging games and ways of thinking about games that are often situated in local, sometimes racialized, but otherwise local communities and cultures, and the ways that they construct and understand the gaming and therefore the genre experience. Yeah, so that'll be coming out from Bloomsbury in either late fall of this year of 2024, early winter of 2025.
Very good. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great to chat.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.